welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tushar Shetty. Now, last month, we've seen some volatility in the South Asian space, shall we say. But, as much as I'd like to comment on the whole India-Pakistan situation, commenting on live events and ongoing situations is not really what we do here in Beyond the Indus. What we really want to do is break down complex, multidimensional issues by going into the historical roots, mapping out the different forces and stakeholders at play, and trying to understand the issues at a local level to deliver a nuanced understanding of why this issue is happening, instead of just how it's playing out at the moment. If you want some detailed coverage of the India-Pakistan situation and the developments in that area, I would strongly recommend going to thediplomat.com, where we have a large roster of journalists and contributors who have written some excellent articles on the situation. What we'll be doing next month is releasing a primer on Kashmir, going into the roots, the evolution, and the present status of the conflict in one of South Asia's most beautiful and contested regions. But until then, stay tuned and please enjoy our latest episode. Our episode this month focuses on tariffs. Yes, Donald Trump's Liberation Day feels like forever ago, yet it's just been a month and a half since the surprise tariff announcements shook the global economy to its core. You see, much of the global economic order since 1991 and possibly since 1945 has been undergirded by one thing: open and unrestricted access to the American consumer. It's access to the American market and American financing that helped the war-ravaged economies of Western Europe emerge out of the ruins of the Second World War, that helped the Asian tigers export their way from poverty to prosperity, that even today so many countries in the global south rely on to sustain their meager economies. Well, Donald Trump's April 2nd announcement changed all that. The tariffs announced, ranging from a uniform 10% tariff on all countries to an unbelievable 145% levied on China specifically, were ostensibly to correct for unfair trade barriers and particularly to reduce the import deficit with China. Now, that narrative might be slightly undermined by a few things. Firstly, the tariff rates were clearly calculated on the individual country's trade surpluses with the United States rather than trade barriers or unfair trade practices per se. This is something that even tariff proponents like Michael Pettis argue is a wrong-headed approach. Individual deficits and surpluses between countries don't matter as much as persistent long-term global surpluses in countries like China, South Korea, and Germany. Now, secondly, just as I was editing this podcast, news came through that China and the US had agreed to reduce tariff rates to 10% and 30% respectively, which sort of begs the question, what was the point of all this? Why was the global economy thrown into a lurch when the US ended up effectively slashing tariffs on the one country that they were meant to target? And where does this leave countries like Sri Lanka and Vietnam, pro-US countries that now have a 40% plus tariff rate in an uncertain and rapidly evolving global trade environment? And that is the subject of today's episode, to see how this tariff chaos will impact countries in South Asia specifically. We'll be speaking to 4 distinguished economic commentators from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh respectively to discuss how tariffs will impact the different economies, get a sense of how local governments and industry plan to respond to this tariff announcement, and understand how the countries of South Asia view the geopolitical and economic shifts that await them in the world beyond the tariffs. Stay tuned. Joining us today to discuss the tariff wars and its impact on India is Priyanka Bhide, co-founder and director of the Kubernetes Initiative, an independent geopolitical think tank advisory firm based in Mumbai, India. Priyanka, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tushar. Happy to be here.
Great. So, Priyanka, India got off relatively lightly as compared to other countries in the region, with approximately 26% tariff imposed as compared to, say, 39% and 44% for Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, respectively. Now, bearing in mind that the final tariff rates are far from certain at this point, how might this impact the Indian economy?
I think to say that we got off lightly is quite relative because if we understand the way these tariffs have been structured from whatever little information is available out there, it's very dependent on the quantity of exports that a country is making into the US. So we have relatively a lesser load of Indian exports going in, and we have an equal balance of the imports coming in. So, as I understand it, the reason we have lower tariffs is because compared to some of these other countries that you've mentioned, our exports are possibly less. Um, Therefore, then in the larger scheme of things, I don't think any country is going to get off very lightly, and the Indian economy is going to have some amount of impact of these tariffs. We have diversified a lot of our partnerships from, if you compare with the first Trump administration, but even so, the US is amongst our top trading partners. And so, for example, there's enough literature now about how, because of the impact on automobile parts manufacturing, some of those industries will be hit. Some of the pharma and some of the steel industries will also be hit. But we are also a big services exporting country. So on that front, we still don't know whether there will be any actions and whether we will suffer there. So that is maybe a space where we might still survive this. But overall, um, given the large amounts of confusion that exists, if you look at it, whether you look at it from an economic aspect or even from a legal aspect, there is a lot of confusion because of which you cannot say that the economy will not suffer at all, but perhaps for now the impact will be lesser than some of these other countries. But we'd have to wait and watch.
Right. And you're based in Mumbai. What is your sense of how the industry and government, respectively, have responded to the tariff announcements? Because US government officials like Scott Bessent have been touting India as one of the first countries that is likely to strike a deal with. Am I right in sensing that India may have some potential economic opportunities as a result of these tariff announcements? I mean, we're seeing recently that Apple has decided to source all its iPhone final exports from India as opposed to China previously. So might there be some potential upside for India in this case?
Any upside I fear will be only temporary because since there's so much uncertainty about, when these tariffs will come into play, my question is with your example on the Apple iPhones, the minute that India gets this kind of export deal, do the tariffs then change? This is something that nobody knows. There's not enough information on how things will pan out. But where I do see the opportunity is in the new trade deal that is being struck between India and USA. And there, I feel, I hope that India will brace for impact and try to minimize the impact as much as possible. And that would only be possible if there's some sort of win-win situation, right? So there will be some impact, but perhaps through this deal, we will be able to reduce the impact. But even in that space now, we'd have to see because there are certain regulatory concerns that I know the US has, for example, in terms of our agricultural regulations that they want reduced. But the reality is that India is still a country where a large part of our population is heavily dependent on agriculture. Our agriculture is still rain fed, and a lot of our country's food security is also dependent on that. So beyond a point, it would not be feasible to kind of agree to some of those demands because we have to, at the end of the day, protect some of those vulnerable communities as well. So it all depends on how some of these negotiations play out. But I am optimistic that they'll play out in a way that we are able to do as much damage control for the short and medium term as possible.
Right. And I think there were some recent announcements, for instance, that India is willing to have reciprocal tariff elimination in areas like steel and auto parts, for instance. I mean, even if whether or not this is going to be the final deal, that shows a sea change in the Indian government's approach towards trade, isn't it? Or is it just, let's say, a show move? They don't intend to follow through with this. What is your view?
I mean, my reading is that it cannot. I mean, it's not a show move, but I think we are trying to make because it is going to impact not only our economy but the entire world. So I think we are trying to come to an understanding that's mutually beneficial. So I think we are being reasonable in that because we see that there are a lot of uncertainties from the US side. So, as far as possible, I think we will be reasonable where possible. But as I said, there are certain areas in which, in a very realistic way, there will be little that as a country will be able to change because domestically, then there might be quite a large outcry as well.
Right. And moving on to, let's say, the broader geopolitics of this, President Trump's foreign policy, particularly after the tariff announcement, has led to considerable discussion in many parts of the globe on the sort of changes to the world economy that are ongoing, as well as the United States' role in it. What is your sense of how these changes might play out, and how would India be placed to take advantage of these shifts? I guess what I'm asking is, how would you see India's position in the world change as a result of these ongoing changes to the global order?
Again, in the short and medium term, I think it's very hard to predict. We are just trying to deal with things as they develop. But we are in a place where global supply chains are now so interconnected that if we are impacted, so will other countries and regions, and the US itself will also be impacted. We're also in a place where, at the end of the day, certain things will remain the same. We are a labor surplus economy because of which some of our production becomes cheap until the USA, for example, is able to perhaps automate some of those aspects of their economy. They'll still need to depend on these external supply chains. But in the long term, how this could pan out, also it could lead to different scenarios, and I think it's anybody's guess what that scenario may be. But seeing as what India has done since the first Trump administration, there's clearly we have tried to diversify our partners. I think more countries around the world with what we are facing now will try to do that. We will perhaps look to make other deals, trade deals as well. There are negotiations on with the EU and the UK. Maybe those will actually um, kind of fructify, and we'd also perhaps engage more with the ASEAN nations and explore other economic opportunities. And this is not just India. I think all countries will now look to see how they could diversify their partnerships, given the uncertainty that we are seeing in US developments.
Right. So you don't see India either replacing China or even long term the United States in its position in the world economy.
It would be I mean, I don't think we are there yet to replace a China, to be quite frank and honest. Uh, but we would have to do that through partnerships. It will, yeah. I don't think there's a direct comparison where it's an either or in terms of what China has achieved, and where we are currently in our growth trajectory.
Great. So potential opportunities, but ultimately India has to resort to, the same strategies and tactics in terms of looking for new partners, looking for perhaps upgrading its supply chain production activities as all the other countries in the world are searching through. So interesting insights. Priyanka, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tushar.
So joining us today to discuss the impact of the tariffs on Pakistan is Washington, D.C. based economic analyst and principal at Asia Group, Uzair Younus. Uzair, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So Uzair, President Trump's announcement on April 2nd included a 29% tariff imposed on Pakistani exports to the U.S. Now, bearing in mind that the final tariff rates are far from certain at this point, could you discuss the impact that this might have on Pakistan's economy?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that many of us have argued for in the past is that Pakistan should become more integrated with the global trade system, trade more, export more, etc. But that hasn't really happened. And so that weakness that has been and remains a historical weakness for Pakistan's economy, in a weird way during this trade war, is a strength, in the sense that because exports are quite muted, the overall impact on GDP, on jobs, on growth, is going to be fairly benign, given what's going on with other countries. In addition to that, the United States still remains a big trading partner and an export market for Pakistan. And in the key sectors that Pakistan exports its products to the United States, in particular textiles and ready-made garments and things like towels and bed sheets, competitive markets like Bangladesh have a higher tariff, which means that overall, Pakistan is unlikely to face significant negative effects from this trade war or the new tariffs that have been imposed on it. Having said that, the broader issue for Pakistan is that if there is a recession in the United States, and as we know that if the United States sneezes, the whole world catches a cold, then the outcome for that, at least on the export side, would be negative for Pakistan, and it would not be sheltered from the implications of a broader slowdown in global growth and growth in the United States in particular. That has second and third order effects for Pakistan that could be positive, which we can talk about as well. But overall, I think compared to other countries, Pakistan is unlikely to be as negatively impacted as, let's say, a country like Bangladesh or China would be.
Right. And I'm sure that you've been hearing discussions coming out of industry and government sources that are, responding to this or maybe thinking about the next steps to take to deal with the situation. What have you been hearing from industry and government, respectively, in Pakistan? And is there any discussion on changes to, Pakistan's long-term economic planning, or maybe discussion about opening up trade relations with other partners like China or the EU?
So at this point in time, I think the economic policymakers in Pakistan remain focused on two or three core objectives. The first one being that in the midst of this trade war, they want to maintain macroeconomic stability, which is related to the balance of payments crisis Pakistan faced a few years ago, because of which it is in the IMF program. So staying in the IMF program is priority number one. Priority number two is to maintain a trajectory within the domestic economy that reduces or maintains a low rate of inflation and creates the space for the central bank to cut interest rates, which yesterday they cut another interest rates by another 100 basis points. And then third is to engage with the United States and find ways in which they can increase the purchase of particular goods from the U.S. itself. So case in point, for example, is many people don't realize this, but Pakistan is a major importer of American Supima cotton, which is used in Pakistan's textile sector, particularly for exports. So can Pakistan import more of American Supima cotton because it is a key input for its exports is being considered. Then there is the topic of soybeans, which again in Pakistan's agriculture economy, American soybean imports have started to play a big role for the poultry supply chain, which again allows access to cheaper nutrition and protein for ordinary citizens. So is there an opportunity to double down on that? And then finally, looking at energy imports or energy relationships with American companies, which again accelerate energy as a case in point, is a major player in Pakistan's LNG market and has been a player and a partner for a number of years now. So those are some of the things that policymakers are looking at and saying, what are the things that Pakistan already needs as imports, and are there opportunities here to double down on the trading relationship with the United States to have some sort of deal or achieve some sort of progress in the bilateral trading relationship.
Right. And just following up on that, because I think that's interesting that Pakistan already has existing import relationships with the United States, because historically, Pakistan has been a more open economy, at least in the 80s, than countries like India have, which is why its growth rate was also better back then. So I guess the United States might not look at Pakistan as a massive problem in terms of its import from the region. Do you also think that there are broader geopolitical considerations when Pakistani policymakers are thinking of, importing more stuff from the US?
I think more than just imports, I think so far Pakistan has taken a pretty good position in terms of engaging with the United States on across sectors beyond even trade. So I mentioned trade already, but for example, even on the broader economic relationship, Pakistan has sent positive signals. For example, in terms of license approvals for Starlink, which has been in the works for a number of months now and has been discussed. But the trade dynamics have added more impetus to positive movement. And the expectation among policymakers in Islamabad is that they're trying to get the bureaucracy to move forward on this on an accelerated basis. Similarly, on the topic of crypto, for example, Pakistan has moved forward aggressively in that space, and in recent weeks has signed a number of agreements, including an agreement with the Trump family-backed crypto organization as well. And Mr. Witkoff's son, for example, was recently in Pakistan as well to sign some deals related to the crypto sector. So on the economic side, they've taken a broader approach as well to engage on topics where Pakistan, by they I mean Pakistan, can engage with U.S. interlocutors who are sort of close to or within the inner circle of the president and the White House. So that's been an interesting evolution of the strategy itself. On the non-economic side as well, if you recall, and your listeners would recall, Pakistan very quickly engaged with the United States on extraditing, first arresting and then extraditing the ISK leader who was behind, or the master planner, as they said it, for the Abbey Gate bombing. And if you recall, President Trump thanked Pakistan during his address to Congress as well. And the CIA chief has talked about this subsequently as well. So I think on the counter-terror side also, Pakistan has engaged in a way that has, I would argue, given it more space than what otherwise would have been anticipated back in November or December of 2024.
Right. And speaking of, let's say, geopolitics, I think it would be remiss of me not to bring up the ongoing geopolitical tensions between India and Pakistan. Now, putting the politics of this aside for a moment, what might be the economic consequences for Pakistan, depending on the various outcomes of this crisis? In case this results in an actively hostile relationship with India, whether that's a hot or cold war, how would this impact Pakistan's long-term economic progress?
I think at this point, right, any escalation or a prolonged confrontation with India would not be great for the Pakistani economy. As we've talked about previously as well, Pakistan has gone through a long economic crisis and only now is beginning to see a return to some level of economic normalcy. And so prolonged conflict would again create new risks, force increased spending or diversion of scarce resources towards defense. And so that would be quite devastating. I think on the trading relationship with India, that has become very limited and very narrow for the last few years. So it's not a direct impact of like additional trade tensions boiling over into GDP impact. But still, border communities rely on cross-border trade, and they will be hurt as a result of this confrontation. And then finally, I would say that at a time when Pakistan is looking to get more investments into Balochistan, particularly in the mining and critical mineral sector, it needs to focus on the counterinsurgency campaign in that province. And a prolonged confrontation with India or a conflict with India would more significantly divert scarce military resources away from Balochistan towards the line of control, which again could bleed into a higher tempo of the insurgency, and as a result of that, limit the pace at which new investments are made in the mining and critical mineral sector in Balochistan. So I think in that sense, conflict or a prolonged confrontation is not in Pakistan's advantage, and I think Pakistani policymakers also understand and appreciate this issue. And finally, I think from a medium to long-term perspective, the big issue Pakistan will have to face, even when this crisis goes away, is the fact that India has decided to suspend the Indus Waters Treaty. And what does that mean for water flows into Pakistan? And as a result of that, the backbone of Pakistan's economy, the agriculture sector and food security, what does that mean for all of these things will be a question for Pakistan's policymakers. I believe innovation can help solve much of these challenges that will come down the road. But this is something that they will have to keep an eye out on and are already talking about in terms of what needs to be done to solve for the potential chaos Pakistan's agriculture sector may face 5, 7, 8 years down the road.
Fantastic. So thanks, Uzair, for joining us and giving us those insights.
Thank you so much.
Umesh Moramudali is a lecturer at the University of Colombo, focusing on public debt dynamics, political economy, and Chinese lending. He also leads public debt research at Arutha, a think tank based in Colombo. Umesh, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tush. Thanks a lot for having me.
So, Umesh, on April 2nd, Liberation Day, as some people call it, Sri Lanka was hit with a whopping 44% tariff rate, one of the highest in South Asia, I think the highest in South Asia. Now, bearing in mind that the final tariff rates are far from certain at this point, could you talk about how this might impact Sri Lanka's economy in its present state?
Well, I mean, no, there are a lot of uncertainties, right? But let's assume for a moment that the tariffs will go ahead as it's announced in 3 months. Let's say this 44% tariff will come into effect for Sri Lanka. In such case, Sri Lanka would be in quite a big trouble due to a few reasons. Firstly, substantial percentage of Sri Lanka's exports are going to the US. In fact, US is Sri Lanka's largest market. 22.8% in 2024. This number has been fairly consistent. It's undoubtedly US being the Sri Lanka's largest export market. If the tariffs comes into effect, then Sri Lanka will not be able to export to US as much as it does. Most of Sri Lanka's exports to US are apparel. That's about 2 billion. And then they have other rubber exports such as tires that are produced in Sri Lanka, and then the gloves, so on and so forth. Apparel amounts to about 2 billion, as I mentioned. And the thing is, like, if the tariffs comes into effect, Sri Lanka's competitors, such as, let's say, entire South Asia, India, Bangladesh, and then many African countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, or even some other Southeast Asian countries, most of these countries has lower tariff than Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is in the certainly top amongst the top 10 countries, right? So the potential for US consumers to shift to other countries is much more. Right? You don't have to pay 44% tariff if you buy from other countries which have relatively lower tariff. So in that case, this is gonna hit quite significantly to Sri Lanka's export revenue. Even if it doesn't affect the entire export revenue, but it's gonna affect it substantially, and substantially affecting means Sri Lanka is gonna lose probably 1.5 to 2 billion of exports per year. That's quite a lot of foreign currency for Sri Lanka. So from that perspective, it's a big shock to Sri Lanka, big shock Sri Lanka will have to digest. And also, I think it's important to understand the context in which these tariffs are imposed. The global context as well as the context in which Sri Lanka is in. Sri Lanka is in the stage of economic recovery, right? As you talked in the previous podcast, country is in an IMF program. We are just after the debt restructuring. We are just recovering. We are not even repaying the debt properly because we need a little bit more time to rebuild the economy. So we are in that recovery phase, right? So in that recovery phase, if exports are going to hit, that's going to also hurt Sri Lanka's debt repayment capacity even in the short term. When I say in the short term, that means this year, next year, and the following year. The more debt repayments comes after 2028, but even before that, Sri Lanka will feel the burden if its exports going to hit. So it's quite a difficult thing to absorb. Of course, there are uncertainties. We don't know what will happen and whether there'll be any policy changes from the US end, because it's been quite chaotic since this tariff announcement being made, right? So that's where it is. I think it's a lot to digest for Sri Lanka. It's a lot risky for Sri Lanka. I would say Sri Lanka is facing a lot more risk than many other countries that will have these tariff impacts due to a few reasons. One being, as I mentioned, because Sri Lanka is in the recovery phase, and then our economy is not really in a good shape as of yet. We are just still recovering. And secondly, Sri Lanka is a small market. Sri Lanka is only like 20 to 22 million people, and we cannot really sell much to that 20 to 22 million people, particularly at a stage of economic recovery. And thirdly, Sri Lanka hasn't actually diversified its export basket much for last 20 years or so. And that's why US keep remaining to be the largest export market for Sri Lanka, averaging for about 25% of total exports every year. We don't export much to India. We don't export much to China. We haven't really explored those East Asian countries as well. So due to these reasons, Sri Lanka is facing quite a big trouble if the tariffs are going ahead as it's announced.
Right, and just a couple of questions on that because, as you mentioned, the tariff announcement, it comes at a time when Sri Lanka is making steady progress, I'd say, in its recovery to the IMF plan. Firstly, has the IMF given any indication that the tariff announcement and the subsequent fallout might lead to maybe changing those terms or maybe giving Sri Lanka some relief? And secondly, I want to understand a little more about how industry and the government, respectively, have reacted to that announcement because, like you said, if there's a lack of diversification, that might prompt industry to perhaps think of some long-term changes. And what about the government? Does it have any plan to reduce the potential negative fallout or to convince the US to lower the rate?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start with the question on the IMF. We've just reached a couple of weeks ago, actually, in fact, 1 week ago, Sri Lanka reached the staff level agreement for the next IMF tranche. So according to IMF, Sri Lanka is making a steady progress, as you mentioned. Only a few minor adjustments to be made. For example, small matters like electricity pricing, so on and so forth. The government had already expressed their willingness to make those changes. IMF does not refer specifically to concessions or relief or any significant adjustments caused by potentially causing by the US tariff. So we don't know yet how IMF would exactly respond to that. They acknowledge in general and also in the case of Sri Lanka that the US tariff could have a substantial impact, but how IMF will digest that, whether they will acknowledge and whether they will make certain adjustments, whether it's restructuring or provide more money or more loans in the short term for Sri Lanka is yet to be seen. They haven't really made any specific reference on that regard. On your question regarding how the governments and industries responding, the government and industry both responded pretty quickly. Industry, the Joint Apparel Association Federation, which is like a collective of all the apparel exporters in Sri Lanka, they came together. They announced that they are willing to support to the government, and the government also acted proactively, I must say. So they appointed a committee which consists of a lot of people in the apparel industry and a lot of people from the private sector, because I think this is a kind of a scenario in which you need a lot of private sector inputs, because at the end of the day, it is the private tech sector that's been dealing with the US. They've been selling goods to US for about last few decades, so on and so forth. So it's important to get their inputs as well. So they appointed a committee, they reviewed what can be done, and I think a delegation alongside of the IMF annual meetings went to US and had discussions with the United States trade representative as well, in which I think certain discussions took place. Few things that we know from the media, what the government disclosed is that the government had expressed willingness, or as the US government has also expressed willingness to keep talking about various options that Sri Lanka can take in order to reduce the impact of the reciprocal tariff. So no specific promises were made at this point. There were no announcement to say that there won't be 44% tariff or anything in that sort. What Sri Lanka had told is that Sri Lanka is willing to look into the avenues in which Sri Lanka can import more from the US. Because as you know, this matter is not really about the tariff level. It is actually about the trade deficit, right? Sri Lanka has quite a big trade surplus with US. That means US has a big trade deficit with Sri Lanka, and that is why US is having a 44% tariff on Sri Lanka. They're planning to have. So to give the context, I think the context is important. The numbers in 2024, Sri Lanka exported 2.9 billion. That is 2,900 million US dollars worth exports to the US. But on the other hand, we only imported around 450 worth imports from the US. So you can clearly see that there's a gap around 2.5 billion. This 44% come from that gap. So 2.5 billion relative to almost 3 billion is 88%. You divide 88% by 2. That is how you ended up with 44, right? It's not about Sri Lanka having high level of tariff for the imports that are coming to US, coming from US. So Sri Lanka cannot fix that issue by doing that, right? So it's a more of a trade deficit issue. Because it's a trade deficit issue, what Sri Lanka has promised is to buy certain goods more from the US. So these goods include LNG, liquid natural gas, and vehicles, some of the machinery, so on and so forth. So that is a one proposal, right? So the idea is that Sri Lanka is telling the US that we are willing to proactively engage with you, and we are willing to reduce our trade surplus with US by importing more from the US. So that means Sri Lanka will have to reduce imports from some other country, which I don't think that the country has figured out as of yet. But that is a one proposal that Sri Lanka had come up with. The other proposal is that, which is also in the rounds, is that maybe to have like a bilateral trade agreement with the United States, right? So by having a bilateral trade agreement, you come to terms, okay, these are the goods that we give you tariff concessions, so that the US imports to Sri Lanka are encouraged. I mean, for example, Sri Lanka has significantly high tariff on vehicle imports across the board, whether you are importing from India, China, Japan, US, UK, from any country. Sri Lanka has significantly high tariff, sometimes more than 200%, sometimes maybe even going up to 300% of the imported value of the vehicle is imports. If you have theoretically, if you have a trade agreement with the US, you could end up giving concessional tariff rate to US. For example, you could have a general tax of 300% for certain type of vehicles, and if you are importing from US, you could end up having 100% or 50% or maybe 0% or something along those lines, right? So by at least 0% is a difficult scenario to have, but let's say 100% compared to 300% to other countries. So that way the consumers in Sri Lanka would be encouraged to import vehicles from the US. So that is a matter that can be done through a trade agreement. By giving the preferential treatment to US, you encourage the import from the US. So that is also another proposal that that is in the discussion. So there are no final discussions as yet, but we can see that government in its capacity and also with the limitations it has try to discuss. But as you understand, this is quite a difficult matter to negotiate, right? We've seen different countries trying to negotiate, like the countries which are strong US allies, doing much more trade with India, much bigger countries with much more much more powerful countries than Sri Lanka. They also ended up not having a final deal, right? So I think at this moment it's about expressing the willingness to proactively negotiate, proactively take certain actions to address the concerns raised by the US. So that I think the government has done to a certain degree.
Right. And stepping outside the pure economics of this, let's say, regardless of the final tariff impact that Sri Lanka is, going to suffer, I would say President Trump's actions have provoked considerable discussion on the future of the world economy and the United States' role in it. Sitting here in Berlin, there's been a particularly strong response from the European Union, at least, as well as the newly, sworn-in German government. How's this conversation playing out in Sri Lanka? And do you see any change in Sri Lanka's strategic calculus in terms of its relationship with the US versus China or even other regional powers?
I think at the moment there are no public discussions, public forums as such about this strategic shift. One of the reasons for that has been Sri Lanka is having a local government election at this point, so a lot of focus is on that. But I can tell you that at more like in the parliament and at the policy level, and at different, maybe in the academic level or among the research community, there is discussion about certainly diversifying Sri Lanka's export market, because Sri Lanka has been, as I mentioned, heavily dependent on US as as its largest export market, and now it has sort of hit Sri Lanka. It has become a problem for Sri Lanka. Now, I think there's a discussion about potentially diversifying export markets, including exporting more to India, exporting more to China, exporting to those Southeast Asian markets, which Sri Lanka hasn't really tapped into. Only around like 5% of Sri Lanka's exports goes to Southeast Asia. So there's a discussion about diversifying that. So that is one end. Secondly, there's also discussion about reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers in Sri Lanka. One of the conversations that stem from this is Sri Lanka has been having a significantly protectionist tariff regime. While it is important that you protect some of the industries that may have potential to build into export industries, you cannot protect all the industries. And Sri Lanka has been protecting far too much sectors and industries, right? I think there's a substantial discussion to move away from that and liberalize some of the sectors that Sri Lanka find it difficult to have any competitive advantage, right? So therefore there's a discussion about what we call a para-tariff reforms, removing the para-tariff. Sri Lanka has a couple of additional tariff other than the custom duties and the VAT. There are discussions about removing those tariffs, and by doing that, becoming a more liberalized tariff regime, and also exploring avenues to join the trade agreements by both bilateral and multilateral. Particularly, there has been discussions about joining the RCEP. This is not something new. This discussion has been there since 2017-18. Now that discussion has renewed, and there's much more incentive to proactively pursue an agreement such as RCEP, and also an agreement such as Economic Technology Cooperation Agreement known as the ETCA with India. So those discussions had certainly renewed. And in terms of geopolitical sides, I think the government is still trying to balance out things. They are not really trying to antagonize the United States. That's very clear from their response. Their representative went to US and had the discussion with United States Special Representative. They didn't try to immediately go to China for solutions. No significant discussions took place with China since the US tariff was announced. On the other hand, we also see that the government maintained important links with the China as well. For example, very interesting fact, in the May Day rally of the government, which is, as we talked, somewhat of a left-leaning party, there was a member of the Chinese Communist Party speaking in the rally. Not only from the Chinese Communist Party, interestingly, actually, a couple of people from the Indian Communist Party, particularly from the Kerala, also spoke in this. So I would say they are desperately trying to balance out things at this point without antagonizing any of the major powers, because that is something strategically Sri Lanka cannot afford. I think that is something that is a harsh reality that the government understands, despite their ideological leanings or the preferences. On the other hand, they are, I think, certainly pursuing much more liberalized trade regimes gradually, particularly looking at the avenues of the trade agreements, because they have specifically mentioned that they are willing to go for the trade agreements and they will take actions towards that. So I think in that context, particularly RCEP would be one of those priorities.
Right. So that was fascinating, Umesh. Thank you for those insights. So joining us today to discuss the impact of the tariffs on the Bangladesh economy is Australia-based macroeconomist Jyoti Rahman, who is a keen observer of the Bangladesh economy. Jyoti, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Tushar, for having me.
So Jyoti, as part of the Liberation Day tariff announcement on April 2nd, US President Donald Trump imposed a 37% tariff on imports from Bangladesh. Now, bearing in mind that the final tariff rates are far from certain, how might this impact Bangladesh's economy?
Yes, so that's the question, and the big unknown here is that we don't actually know what the tariff rates are, what what there will be.
So there's a lot of uncertainty around, not just with respect to Bangladesh, but overall U.S. tariff policy or U.S. government or Trump administration's economic agenda. So I think the biggest impact, both globally and therefore for Bangladesh, is whether the uncertainty tips the U.S. economy into a recession, and if the U.S. goes into a recession, then what happens to the rest of the world, the global economy? So market observers are pricing in at least a short recession or a shallow recession in the U.S. I think that's sort of is now in the numbers. They shrunk, their GDP shrunk in the first quarter. If you've got 2 quarters of negative growth, then that's a technical recession. So I think that's sort of priced in. But the what happens next is the unknown. If we look at what happened to Bangladesh economy the last time, not the COVID one, but the one before, in 2008-9 or 7-8-9 during the global financial crisis, at that time, Bangladesh economy actually did not fare as badly as people initially feared. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One was that the so-called Walmart effect. So, sort of Bangladesh's main export is garments. Within garments, it's mainly towards the lower end of the market. So, sort of Walmart, as you know, is the big retailer which sells, relatively budget and cheaper product. So during a recession, people lose jobs. Sort of instead of buying a brand T-shirt or a sort of brand jumper, you might go to Walmart and buy something cheaper. So that worked out fairly well for Bangladesh last time. Would the same thing play out this time? That's a big question mark. The other thing that Bangladesh did last time, also in the garments space, was that it actually expanded or diversified into other markets. So before 2007, before that crisis or that recession, U.S. market share for Bangladesh export was higher. During the recession, Bangladesh diversified into or opened into new markets such as Japan. So, sort of again, something like that could happen. Who knows? So that's one channel. The other channel is, of course, remittance. So Bangladesh economy has two engines. One is garments, the other one is remittance. With remittance, last time remittances actually stayed fairly strong. And the reason for that was because straight after the global crisis or the sort of Lehman Brothers and all of that, there were a lot of fiscal stimulus around the world, particularly China, and that kept the oil prices high or up, or the resource prices up, which kept the Middle Eastern Gulf countries fairly strong, and that kept the remittances fairly strong because sort of Middle Eastern countries had a construction boom, and therefore needed a lot of Bangladeshi workers, and therefore remittances stayed relatively solid. This time round, China is not in a position to give, do as strong a fiscal stimulus as they did 15 years ago, 6 ago. And there is probably not that much scope for fiscal stimulus in Europe or other countries either. And that probably would mean, all else equal, the Gulf markets are probably not going to be as robust as they were 15, 16 years. And that could hurt remittances, particularly if the recession proves to be longer, if it proves to be deeper, or if the recovery proves to be weaker, then sort of we would have those channels coming in. So this is sort of like the macroeconomic side of things. And then the other question is, what would the tariffs themselves? Let's say that sort of they actually did come back in 90 days, or 80 days now, or 75 days. That the 37% actually did come into effect. If that happens, then the thing to remember here is that Bangladesh is not the only country that's going to be hit by this. So on garment space, Bangladesh's big competitors are Vietnam, Cambodia, and those countries have probably sort of similar rates of tariff, and those countries are actually much more exposed to the U.S. market than Bangladesh, at least in garments area. On the other hand, particularly Vietnam, their overall export basket is more diversified than Bangladesh. So one effect could be that they undercut Bangladesh on prices, right? And that could lead to serious problems because garments is not a high margin business. Sort of. So this, if Vietnam starts undercutting Bangladesh on prices, that could affect Bangladeshi jobs. Right. So sort of wages would be compressed, and that would obviously have flow-on effects.
Right. And I think that's an important point because Bangladesh, I think, is the export success story in South Asia. It has an export-oriented economic model, but at the same time, its reliance on a few key export sectors like ready-made garments, I think leaves it particularly vulnerable to tariffs from the US, which is, I think, Bangladesh's largest export destination, if I'm not mistaken. How are the government and industry respectively reacting to the situation? Are they taking any steps to address these economic vulnerabilities in the long run, perhaps by diversifying or reorienting trade to new destinations?
Right. Yes. So, sort of, yes, you are right that Bangladesh is, sort of, whilst, sort of the exports have definitely driven growth over the last 20, 30 years, sort of, and lifted, millions of people out of poverty. It still is very much a one-trick pony. It's garments, and within garments, it's basically 4 or 5 specific items. Um, and like sort of, so one way to think about this is that over the last 10, 15 years Bangladesh had actually sort of got into this comfort zone where sort of the producers are very good at sort of chugging these things out in sort of good quality, cheap prices, and they're like sort of and they're happy doing what they're doing. So sort of, if you are a garment owner, you didn't really have until recently, sort of much need to diversify your line, much need to, sort of think of new products or think of new markets and so on. In fact, the last time we had market diversification was actually during the 2009-10, after the global financial crisis, when we, the garments found Japan as a new market. So in that sense, this pressure could sort of potentially push the factory owners or sort of producers into thinking about new markets or new products and so. So that's one thing. What is the government doing? So as you know, Bangladesh had a change in government last year. And we probably will talk about that a bit later. So the new government that came in after the July uprising last year against the Hasina regime, they initiated a whole bunch of task force, commissions, committees to come up with reform ideas. So one of these was a white paper on the economy that was sort of like backward looking, what had happened to the economy over the last 15, 20 years. And then there was a task force on economic reprioritization. And both have produced volumes of analysis and actually have come up with a set of actionable things, some of which would probably require an elected government because they are inherently political. So, for example, Bangladesh doesn't actually have much fiscal space. Government doesn't really, so sort of tax to GDP ratio is very low. Income taxes are very low, and if the government doesn't have money, then government cannot really do things. So sort of, but if you don't have an elected government, it is very difficult to do tax reform. So those kind of things probably will have to wait until there is an elected government. But there are other things that can be done even by the interim government. So, for example, Chittagong port, Bangladesh's main port, is incredibly inefficient. It takes 4, 5, 6 times more to do a set of activities in Chittagong than in, say, Ho Chi Minh City or sort of other ports in Southeast Asia. And a lot of this stuff is bureaucratic, or a lot of this stuff is just bad practices. Um, petty corruption in the docks and things like that. So the interim government is in negotiations with foreign investors, potentially from the UAE, Dubai ports, potentially from Singapore or Denmark. So, there are potential foreign investors that are talking to, the interim government is talking to, and this kind of stuff does not require an election. It doesn't require a parliament. It's something that the current government, even though it's interim, they can do through executive authority. And there is actually domestic support for that, because everyone understands that the status quo with the port is a problem, and we cannot we cannot really become a manufacturing hub if it takes 5 times longer to unload your things in Chittagong compared with somewhere in Vietnam or somewhere in Philippines. So this is something that is actually high on the interim government's agenda, and potentially we could see some results in next few months.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's also significant that the chief advisor of Bangladesh right now is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Mohammed Yunus. So, he certainly has the knowledge and hopefully the capacity to implement these long-term reforms because he understands these global trends much better. But I do want to ask about this the political transformation that Bangladesh underwent in the past 10 months. We've seen after the ouster of Sheikh Hasina, there's been a lot of changes in Bangladesh. It was a momentous political transformation. We did cover it here on Beyond the Indus. But it's also led to certain changes in its foreign policy. We saw, I think, the chief advisor's visit to China earlier this year, where he met Xi Jinping. It's led to a deterioration of relations with India. So I just want to ask you a two-part question on how the politics of this is impacting the economy. So the first part of that is, how have political developments within Bangladesh impacted its industry and economic situation over the past 10 months? And the second part would be, is there any evidence that you're seeing right now of a rethink in Bangladesh's policy and foreign policy and geopolitical calculations as a result of the tariff announcement?
Right. Okay. So the first part is easier to answer than the second part. So I'll start with the first part. Okay. Look, so one thing, so as you noted, that Professor Yunus, he's an economist. Has been involved in the development of the country or poverty reduction story for basically since the country's birth 5 decades ago, right? So he has seen the transformation. He has lived the transformation of Bangladesh from a poverty backwater to a a development success story. And at the same time, he has also lived the political turmoils as well. So he is aware of what needs to be done and what can be done. So that's the upside. He has had a very rocky start through no fault of his own or no fault of the interim government. The what happened in Bangladesh, as you know, in July, August was a big shock, right? And the shock came after a few years of economic turmoil. The last couple of years of the Hasina regime was actually there were economic instability, particularly towards the end. There was a massive plunder of the banks. That the cronies or oligarchs connected with Hasina borrowed insane amount of money and then siphoned a lot of that off. And we're talking about billions of dollars, and to offshore accounts and so on. So banks, when the new government came in, they found that banks were essentially empty. So that was one issue. The other thing was that, and because of the siphoning off, there was a run on taka. Taka, Bangladesh currency, had gone from about 85 taka against US dollar in mid 2022 to something like about 120, 125 in about 2 years. So that's a massive depreciation, right? This kind of depreciation is something that you see when a country has a a meltdown, like the way that had happened in Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh did not formally have a economic meltdown like that, but sort of the effects were the facts were that the currency went from 85 taka to 120, 125 taka. At the same time, Bangladesh lost about $20 billion worth of reserves, probably more. Something like from 45 40 plus billion dollars of foreign reserve, it fell to well below 20. So, and then when your currency depreciates, that pushes up imported prices. And Bangladesh imports a lot of food, a lot of oil, or energy. So, and those things then drives inflation up. So this is what happened. This was the climate that Yunus and the team came into, that the banks were empty, reserves were falling, taka was depreciating, inflation was high. And by the way, the high inflation was probably indirectly, at least, one of the things that contributed to the uprising. It's all, democracy is very important, elections are very important, but when prices of essentials go up, that's when people come out in the streets and lose the fear of police repressions and so on, right? So on these fronts, the government have actually managed to stabilize things fairly well. There hasn't been any bank failure. So back in August, September, there were genuine concerns that we might actually see run on banks. Basically, depositors would rush to withdraw their money, and the banks wouldn't have the money, and then you would have basically rioting in the streets. This was a serious concern back in September, and this hasn't happened, right? Currency has been steady. In fact, taka has, not only has it been steady, it probably, if the currency was actually fully floating right now, it probably would be appreciating a bit against the dollar. Reserves have been steady, so they have stabilized the country or stabilized the economy. One problem that they still face, and this would probably also affect their ability to implement anything in Chittagong ports or do any of these legal reforms that I talked about before, is that the bureaucracy is still saddled with people who were loyal to the Hasina regime, or are incompetent, or are corrupt. And that kind of bureaucratic reform is probably very difficult to do for an interim government. So that remains a big risk factor. So so that's probably what I would say on the first part, that the economy has stabilized. Of course, the tariff shocks are sort of a clear and present danger, both from the macroeconomic perspective that we talked about before, but also that they present an opportunity for diversifying the market, diversifying destinations as well as product mix, and the structural things that the government would need to do, such as for the Chittagong port or the legal reforms. There is awareness of what needs to be done. There is, in principle, agreement to do these things. How much of these actually can be done by the interim government? How much, or what would need to happen? What we would need to wait for until the election? Those are the kind of questions. So that's the first part of your question. Second part, now that is actually a lot more tricky, the geopolitical part. So one thing that the Hasina regime had so Bangladesh has traditionally had to juggle the three relationships. One is India, of course, its largest neighbor, biggest trading partner, and so on. So India is obviously, there's a historic relationship. China has been Bangladesh's top development partner, and also a trade partner, and investment partner on and off for for many decades as well. So that's the other big relationship. And then, of course, there's the US. And Hasina had actually juggled these reasonably well until she ran out of options. With India, she had made all sorts of security arrangements, and gave companies like Adani sort of other Indian firms preferential deals. So, for example, the power purchasing agreement with Adani is comically one-sided, where sort of Bangladesh government bears all the risks, and sort of Adani gets money even if he doesn't have to do anything. So that was the relationship with India. And then sort of to balance that, she had also given concessions and borrowed from China, and the US was not fussed with any of that stuff during the time of war on terror, because sort of she said she was going to crack down, or she did. She claimed to have cracked down on the Islamists, but also she used that as an excuse to sort of to drive her own domestic political agenda of repressing the democratic opposition. So that was what she did. Now she's gone, and it's not really clear whether it is quite clear that the interim government or any potential elected BNP government, they would neither want to replicate Hasina in sort of driving that kind of those kind of bargains. So that bit is very clear. What is not clear at all is what they would do. With respect to India, the as long as Hasina and other top Awami League leaders, or leaders of the previous regime, are present in India, I don't see any rapprochement happening in Bangladesh at all. The politics just simply would not allow. So it's not just the interim government. Even if the BNP comes in with a thumping majority, the moment they soften their tone against India, sort of they would face a political backlash.
Right. So that's very interesting, actually. And it's quite a detailed matrix of Bangladesh's geopolitical decisions that I don't think we've discussed before. That was fascinating, Jyoti. Thank you so much for those insights.